Democrats in huge numbers tell pollsters they're going to vote by mail. In some cases, it's 80 to 20. Republicans, much less, maybe 50-50. Republicans listen to Donald Trump. Donald Trump says mail-in voting is bad and fraudulent. So Republicans who used to have an advantage in mail-in voting are now deciding not to vote by mail, and the president could be hurting himself. In other words, this could backfire. In a state like Florida, if Republicans decide not to vote by mail, and a lot of them are seniors, maybe they'll just stay home because they don't want to go to the polls during the pandemic. Now, the interesting thing about the Trump campaign messaging is they're trying to say, don't vote by mail except in Florida, because Florida is an interesting state. Among the battleground states, it's the only one that actually counts and reports its mail-in ballots on election night.
Right.
And many Democrats think Trump is planning to, if he's ahead on election night with the ballots counted just that day, declare victory and say any other ballots that come in later are fraudulent.
As international political correspondent Mara Liasson.
At least 35 people have died in the fast-moving wildfires across California, Oregon, and Washington state. And the governors of all three states have been explicit about their belief in the link between climate change and the severity of this wildfire season, as temperatures get hotter and conditions drier. But President Trump, who is expected to visit Northern California today, blamed the massive wildfires on another problem.
It's about forest management and other things, but forest management.
Let's bring in Ezra Romero. He's a reporter for Capital Public Radio in Sacramento. Hi, Ezra.
Hello.
Well, first of all, is President Trump correct in his criticism? How much does land and forest management factor into the magnitude of these wildfires that we're experiencing right now?
Well, forest management does play a huge role in all of this, but then there's a huge factor in all of that, climate change making the problem worse. There's been more than a century of fire suppression on the land, and that's dating back to like 1910. This big Great Fire burned 3 million acres of the West then. And then after that, the Forest Service created a policy to put fires out as quickly as possible. So that mentality spread across the states, and it resulted in very few big fires and so much overgrowth of dead and alive trees and brushing and grass and land. Just to put this in a little bit of perspective, there's around 33 million acres of forest in California. About 57% of that, or 19 million acres, is managed and owned by the Forest Service and other federal entities. Only 3% is owned by the state, 80% is managed by families, Native Americans, and companies, and 14% by timber. And so there's just 9 million acres owned by people individually. So there's this tension we're in. We know we have to clean the forest in this way, but we're also in a tension of we're not in a place where we're funded to do that.
You've been talking with quite a few experts about this. What have they been saying to you?
Well, I want to be clear here, they all say we need to do more in the off-season exponentially. But climate scientists are clear that if we don't get the climate crisis under control, we are going to be in the cyclical cycle of having fire on the landscape of this size and scale. Yes, California's a Mediterranean climate. Fires have happened here for millennia. Some UC Berkeley scientists found that before the year 1800, there was about 4.5 million acres of land that burned here every year. So it's a natural phenomenon here. But scientists say that if we hit a magical button and all the land was clean and clear and all this underbrush and understory was nice and dandy, the climate crisis would still be there. And fires would still be happening at a higher rate than they were in the past.
So you really can't separate these two, climate change and really the caring for the land and the clearing of the land.
Exactly, and that's exacerbated today even by the fact that there's 40 million Californians. That wasn't what it was 100 years ago, and there's about 3 million people who live in these forested areas. So it's a complex issue.
That was Ezra Romero. He's a reporter for Capital Public Radio in Sacramento. You're listening to Here and Now.
This is 90.9 FM WHYY.
With deaths from COVID-19 mounting, Dr. Atul Gawande says it's high time the U.S. deploys a national testing strategy.
This is as big as any casualty situation we've ever had. There is no reason we could not be deploying the dedicated effort to make this work.
I'm Mary Louise Kelly, solving the coronavirus test mess this afternoon on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Later today at 4 on WHYY.
I'm Steve Brown. A police officer in Pennsylvania fatally shot a man during a domestic disturbance call, prompting street protests that led to vandalism. Posted by the officer's body camera video on social media showed the man chasing the officer down the sidewalk with a knife before he was fatally shot. Hurricane Paulette made a rare landfall in Bermuda early today and strengthened into a Category 2 storm just hours after the wealthy British territory shuttered schools, government agencies, air and seaports. While the storm passed over the island, as government officials warned of heavy flooding, given that the hit coincided with an unusually high tide. Astronomers looking at the atmosphere in neighboring Venus see something that might just be a sign of life. A study published today, they say they found the chemical signature of a noxious gas called phosphine. On Earth, phosphine is associated with life. You're listening to Here and Now.
On 90.9, it's 119. After months of being closed due to the pandemic, museums around the country are slowly starting to welcome back visitors. The world they are opening their doors to, however, has changed dramatically. We'll hear from two museum professionals about the future of museums in light of both the pandemic and renewed calls for racial equality. That's next.
Supporting WHYY, Penn Medicine's primary care services are now available at over 40 locations, with most offering same-day appointments and extended and weekend hours. And through Penn's online patient portal, patients can securely access their medical records, request prescription refills, and communicate with their healthcare providers. Penn Medicine wants to make staying healthy as easy as possible, now accepting new patients. PennMedicine.org/primary care.
The sun, it's still there, 75 degrees, heading for a high of 79 this afternoon. And it's going to be quite cool tonight, mostly clear, going down to around 53.
Funding for Here and Now comes from WBUR Boston and Staples, with supplies to get business done no matter where it gets done. From ink and toner cartridges to technology like webcams and networking accessories. More at Staples stores or staples.com. Staples.
This is Here and Now. Museums throughout the country are slowly welcoming back visitors. But in the midst of this pandemic and the ongoing protests for racial justice, the world they are opening their doors to has changed significantly, and curators are now thinking deeply about how to reflect our new reality and the roles they play in society. To talk more about this, I have Portia Moore, professor of museum studies at the University of Florida and co-creator of Visions of Color, and Tyree Boyd Pates, an associate curator of Western history at the Autry Museum of the American West in LA. Welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So Tyree, I want to start with you. You joined the Autry Museum here in LA at the end of last year, but you've been in this space for a while now to recenter Black histories in museum spaces. How have you as a curator in this moment been re-examining the role of the museum, and what have you been doing during this time to respond to the moment?
Museum curators, as well as museums themselves, are seeking to rise to the occasion. We all find ourselves in a historical moment, and at the Autry Museum, we are reimagining and wrinkling the interpretation of who, in fact, inhabits the American West. Currently, I am spearheading an initiative entitled Collecting Community History, the West during COVID-19, as well as BLM protests in the West, which is a archival historical project that seeks to aggregate and generate content from the communities that surround the museum so that we can better retell this moment for future generations.
Portia, the way Tyree is thinking is kind of a difference from what many museums have historically viewed what should be exhibited. I'm thinking about the 1960s New York Met exhibit all about Harlem that excluded Black artists, and the Met actually just recently came under fire with staff saying that it has a culture of systemic racism. Portia, what is the history and legacy of museums in this country? How do we get to the real purpose of museums, to capture the art and history of right now?
The number of call-outs that we've seen in the last several weeks in terms of naming and identifying systemic and institutional racism, I think speaks to the fact that our institutions and those who work in our field have never really had to think about whiteness and to think about dismantling whiteness and to really unpack the power of racial literacy. And so when I think about the work that curators like Tyree are doing, when I think about the things that people are doing across the country, I think one of the things that we can do is to help us understand the ways in which our cultural heritage institutions can actually rise to this moment and rise to the occasion, and helping us to think about how we can actually really grow and evolve and transform to 21st century cultural heritage information centers. So there's actually no museum in America right now, regardless of their mission and their vision and their collecting practices, that is unable to kind of help promote necessary 21st century literacy. So some of those literacies could include historical literacy, civic literacy, digital literacy, and then critically and specifically really thinking about this notion of the canon, troubling what Toni Morrison calls the master narrative, and allowing us to get back to the place where we can sort of decenter whiteness.
You're also working on making museums accessible and welcoming spaces. You've created a space called Visitors of Color, which pushes museums to think of visitors as active participants and not just donors or patrons of the arts. Can you say more about that?
So the Visitors of Color project is a counter-narrative project. It's our sort of offering to help museum professionals especially understand the ways in which we have to problematize this notion of welcoming and belonging, the ways in which we unintentionally other our visitors, and helping us to understand the ways in which we think about everything from our behaviors, so the ways in which we sort of police Black bodies in white spaces, the ways in which we do or do not promote joy, the ways in which we tell narratives that actually can be traumatizing or triggering.
Tyree, how much are you thinking about what Portia is saying when you're thinking about who might be coming to the museum when you curate exhibits?
Thinking of communities of color, particularly the Black community, at the top of mind, I always want to make sure that their stories are centered on the gallery walls, that they feel dignified and elevated when they see representations of themselves on those walls, as well as an opportunity to further investigate what their history has always been, irrespective of who has chosen to center it.
That's really interesting. Do you